This is Gender and Politics for Thursday, April 2nd, 2020. We'll be meeting this afternoon at 3 and Tuesday at 3. Your midterm, of course, as I mentioned, after class today, I'll send out your midterm, and you'll have the weekend until around midnight on Sunday, 11:59 p.m. to email it back to me either by scanning or by typing it out. And I've just made a decision. You can use your books and notes for this. It's open book and notes. So, all right. We're turning today to the first truly great work of feminism in human history, and that is Mary Wollstonecraft's The Vindication of the Rights of Woman. Of course, this, by the way, was Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley's mother, who wrote Frankenstein. Anyway, that's just an interesting fact. The purpose of and the notes for today, which it would be useful if you had in front of you, we'll cover both today and Tuesday. So this video lecture for today will be the only part that I'll preface with a video lecture. We'll just do our class session on Zoom today and Tuesday. So anyway, the purpose of these comments is to provide some background and to sketch out some background to Mary Wollstonecraft and the Vindication, and published in 1792, and also to sort of lay out her main argument and raise the primary questions that we'll be discussing. So Roman number 1 of the notes is this, and this discussion is a kind of a bridge between what we discussed in the Saxon House book and her first and last chapters, and her overall thesis, and Wollstonecraft. And my first comments will be a little repetitive of what we discussed on Tuesday from Wollstonecraft. So if I may be so literal as to read my notes, it's important to keep in mind that the following aspects of Wollstonecraft's background, and here I want to make an important point, that in discussing the background, I'm not reducing Wollstonecraft to her background. This is a great issue in interpretation of classical texts and important texts in political philosophy or texts in general. All authors, all human beings are products of their times. That means that the culture around them, their society, their politics, obviously have an influence on them. But as we've been discussing from the beginning of this class, what political philosophy is, since this is a course in political philosophy and political theory, all of us, and I think if you looked inside yourselves, you might be shocked by what you saw, but once you recovered from what you saw when you looked inside yourselves, I think all of us understand that some of us are more the products of our environment, and some of us are more reflective about our environment. Political philosophy is the human attempt to become absolutely self-conscious about who and what one is, what a human being is, but who one is, who you are, who I am. God knows who I am. There are so many of us in here right now. Obviously, well, for instance, to use an analogy, and we're going to come back to this when we talk about what the meaning of enlightenment is. You all grew up. Yes, I'm 67 years old, and I'm still in the process of it, but what can I say? Medical science can't do everything. You know that as you grew up, your capacity to be aware of your environment, to think it through, not simply to be the result of the forces around you and inside of you, grew as your human consciousness grew. And to some degree, that's what the process of philosophy is. Some human beings are more capable, and if you remember when we discussed Plato and the Republic, his great image of the cave at the beginning of Book 7 of the Republic, which we talked about in class, not every human being is equally capable of becoming aware of the nature of his or her beliefs and the beliefs of one society and the culture around one. not everybody is capable of climbing to the summit of the mountain. But again, to restate this, the aim of political philosophy is to try to ascend upwards from one's local culture and ideas, and try to grasp the nature of human beings as human beings, and the nature of the human condition, and even the nature of the cosmos. So this great issue in political philosophy is to what extent important authors are to be understood primarily as reflections of the ideas and forces and culture and politics and society of their time, or to what extent you can look at their works as independent attempts by the human mind to free themselves, and in some ways to see their great works as transcendent. Now, I'm not and just a bit of autobiography. It was a dark and stormy night when I was born. I'm just kidding about that. The school of political philosophy that I was trained in, founded by Leo Strauss, who was the teacher of most of my teachers in graduate school, argues that the great political philosophers are probably those who are most successful at rising above the foundations of their time, and actually, like Machiavelli, say, as Saxonhouse talks about him, or Hobbes or Locke or Aristotle or Plato, are, even though it helps to render their works intelligible to get some sense of the surrounding background and culture, yet their presentations of the human condition in their works are so strongly self-conscious that they could be read in their own rights. That's my orientation. And but even so, it would be ridiculous not to look at some of the aspects of an author's situation. By the way, this issue also exists in literary interpretation. All of you have had English classes, and you've all struggled with the question of to what extent an author, like Shakespeare, for instance, is to be understood as a great mind whose works reflect his grasp of the human condition, and therefore, and here's what's at stake, by the way: how you read classical texts of literature and philosophy also determines the question, or is related to the question, of what their relevance to us is. If an author, if a philosopher or a playwright or a poet is simply a reflection of the world around them, then our interest in them in some ways might be like visiting a foreign country, except we're going like back to the museum of the past or something like that. But if you believe that in some ways these great philosophers or authors have risen above their locality and their temporality, then in some ways they speak to us directly, because and we don't read them just to find out what life was like in the 16th century or the 17th century. We read them in order to work through the great issues that present all human beings in all societies at all times. And again, I would argue that that's the core task of political philosophy. And that's what I'm trying to do in this class, is use the issue of gender as a way of examining the meaning of the human condition, especially through the lens of the great philosophers, and in the second part of this course, really the great modern feminists who have profoundly reshaped the human world that you and I live in. So with that in mind, that's just to remind you that the points about this background aren't simply to reduce Wollstonecraft to an expression of the Enlightenment or this kind of stuff. She's a thinker in her own right, but it may be helpful to see how certain themes emerge in her work, given what she's addressing in this work. And by the way, we've mentioned this in class. The title of this work, The Vindication of the Rights of Woman, is clearly a response to the publication of the Rights of Man as one of the foundational documents of the French Revolution in 1789. So it's easy to see on one level, from the immediate background of Wollstonecraft, why she entitled this book and what she's trying to do in this book. She's clearly an advocate of the ideology or the political philosophy that comes out of modernity, as Saxonhouse discusses it, and as we're going to see, we're going to look primarily in terms of her philosophic predecessors, of Thomas Hobbes, although we'll talk about others. And the movement of thought, political thought, cultural thought, etc., and scientific thought that emerged from these great philosophers of the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries called the Enlightenment. So she's clearly, as you're going to see, an advocate of these core ideas that emerge at this time. But the title of her book clearly addresses the fact that she thinks that something's in an important topic has been left out of these great works and the emergent political and cultural reform movements that they generated, and that is, of course, the place of women in the world. So, in addition to looking at the backgrounds in general, we'll, in Roman numeral 2 of these notes, we'll actually then sketch out the main method or set of questions by which we'll unpack her book. And as you're going to see, certainly Friedan and a couple of the other major feminists, contemporary feminists and authors. So to go back to the top of the first page of the notes and this point that I'm making, I'm talking about her background without reducing her to it, but I and let me just be quite honest about the profundity or the originality of her thought. She, as a thinker, as an author, assumes certain things as givens. And the core givens of her philosophy, which become the ground of her feminism, and I think probably, as Saxonhouse suggests, the grounds of almost all currents of modern feminism, the givens are the philosophy of the Enlightenment, the philosophy of individual rights, of liberalism, which we've already examined to some degree in Saxonhouse. And that means, of course, the philosophy of rights, of human rights, of natural rights, and the idea that the core qualities that have to be philosophically examined and articulated regarding human existence are freedom, equality, and stemming from Machiavelli, the idea that the core issue in human life, in individual's life, and in politics in general, is power. Saxonhouse examines this theme fairly exhaustively, but I want to re-emphasize it here by stressing an implication of liberalism that she does not explore explicitly, that is to say, Saxonhouse, but which becomes central to almost all critical modern feminist writings, and that is the issue of power. In this sense, seeing liberalism as a form of diffuse and softened Machiavellianism, which is Saxonhouse's thesis and my approach to some degree, helps to understand the emphasis of power and the understanding of virtue that accompanies this view of human life. Why raise this question? Because as you're going to see, one of the central organizing concepts of Wollstonecraft's view of human life and of women in society is virtue. Very crudely put, she's going to argue that the traditional role that women occupy in society denies them access to their virtue. That's not unlike, by the way, the argument that Plato and Aristotle in some degrees make, although it goes in a very different direction with those ancient philosophers. And as we examined, even though both Plato and Aristotle think that virtue is in some ways the theme of human life, when it comes to men and women, we saw that they have quite different takes on this. But understand, for those of you that have had modern political philosophy, Charlize and Amanda, you know that Machiavelli also, in The Prince and in his other writings, talks about virtue, redefining it as the human capacity in the world to get what you want, which is quite different from what the Bible or Aristotle or Plato or the ancient philosophers or most of antiquity means by virtue. But you're going to see, Wollstonecraft has also, to some degree, a somewhat elevated notion of virtue, and that's one of the things we'll unpack in working through her work. So to continue, in what sense the philosophic background of Wollstonecraft is this, in my notes, I bolded it there in the first time, diffuse and softened Lockean Machiavellianism. That's a mouthful. Which means that survival is the one thing needful, the decisive theme of human life. Human virtue is reason in the calculation of one's advantage. Power is what secures survival. So, as we're going to, if you've had modern political philosophy, or if you've read Locke or Hobbes, you understand that, like Aristotle and Plato, these great philosophers think that human reason is in some ways the crown of human consciousness, and that capacity in human beings which gives us the ability to navigate our ways in the world. But what reason is, and this is where this is a core Machiavellianism, but this is Hobbesianism, and also Locke, and for that matter, even Rousseau and the other philosophers of the Enlightenment, Hume, Smith, etc. What reason is calculation, and is the capacity to calculate one's advantage and to act on it. So this is important to stress. There is an image of virtue here, as I mentioned just a minute ago, one that shares with Aristotle and Plato. But if you consider the development of reason to be the core of human perfection or rationality, then that determines what you think a human life should look like. And as I said a minute ago, the crude statement of, or the broader general statement of Wollstonecraft's thesis is that the traditional role assigned to women and their place in society denies them access to this capacity for rational calculation that is the hallmark of an independent and free human being. All right. So the larger background term that we need to examine is the concept of enlightenment. And here, in these comments, I'm going to use enlightenment in two senses. One, as a historical period, historians of culture and politics and thought designate this part of Western modernity, and by modernity, generally speaking, that period in human life, both in philosophy, religion, culture, politics, science, stemming from about 1600 to about 1800. And essentially initiated by the thought of Machiavelli, but then in terms of religious life too, initiated by the Reformation, by Luther and Calvin. So that unleashed this great reform of human life that in the thought of philosophers like Hobbes and Descartes, who were contemporaries, René Descartes, who wrote the Discourse on Scientific Method, from those of you that had political philosophy, in 1637, or Hobbes, who wrote Leviathan in 1651, Locke, who wrote the Second Treatise in 1689, Montesquieu, who wrote in The Spirit of Laws in 1733, Rousseau, who wrote the First and Second Discourses in the 1750s, Hume, Smith, and of course the American and French Revolutions in the 1780s and 90s. In Smith, who published *The Wealth of Nations*, the theory of the modern free market, and the theory of moral sentiments in 1776, the same year as the American Revolution. So this period is called the Enlightenment, roughly, I would say, 1650 to 1600. And what does that mean, enlightenment? La lumière, as the French say, the Ausklärung in German. It was the spread of reason and the idea of rights and science and education, and Wollstonecraft is very much within this movement. The idea that this period in human history, enlightenment. By the way, when I teach political philosophy or when I taught ideas in culture, I like to use a couplet from Alexander Pope's, who was the great English poet who lived at the time of Newton, etc. And the publication of Newton's Principia was understood to be like a major moment in human consciousness in which science stepped up to the plate in terms of explaining the cosmos around us. And if you had to read Alexander Pope in high school English, you know it can be, for a young adolescent, about as exciting as licking concrete bricks. But nevertheless, here's this great couplet. Nature and nature's laws lay hid in night. God said, let Newton be, and all was light. So this idea that in this period of human history, that the real principles of science and reason and grasp of nature and of the human condition, and especially the revolutionary concept of rights, began to transform the human right. And obviously, if you ask your question, what's the opposite of enlightenment? Well, it's darkness. And just as Pope says, nature and nature's laws lay hid in night. So the thinkers of this time, including Wollstonecraft, understood that this was a period in which the true principles, and by the way, the founders of the American Republic essentially made the same point, lay hid in night. And so this was a period in which humanity was emerging from its precedent darkness. Now, this leads to the second and broader notion of enlightenment, and that is the view of human history overall that becomes embedded in the thought of this time. And that the idea is that human history overall is a period of enlightenment, in the sense that the transition from childhood to adulthood is a period of enlightenment for every human being. Here, and you'll see, you have to grasp this concept because this becomes critical for understanding Wollstonecraft's take on female oppression and female liberation. That the overall tone of human history, and let me just say that the two great German philosophers who took the concepts of the Enlightenment and developed them into this broader sense of enlightenment, which one could basically call progress, were Immanuel Kant in the 1780s and 90s, and George William Friedrich Hegel, who wrote in the 1820s. These two German philosophers took the ideas of the Enlightenment and expanded them in the notion that human history itself is a dialectical, to use the typical philosophic term, and of course that becomes critical to Marxism, that human history is and that the human race, what history is a story of progress from earlier ignorance and darkness and subjugation to the forces and laws of nature in us around us, and an originally primitive, childlike grasp of the human world, which over time has become more wise and complex and self-conscious, and therefore underneath the period of the Enlightenment is this concept of progress, that the human race begins in an originally primitive, childlike, ignorant, superstitious, and of course the idea is almost all the religious traditions of humanity are a product of this period of time. And for Wollstonecraft and modern feminism, the emergence and development of the human of the role concept of gender role was part of this earlier form of primitivity. So in the middle of the notes of the first page, just to repeat this, in this notion of progress or enlightenment, human history is a story. There's a trajectory to human history, and that is from that earlier primitivity, superstition, irrationality, and hence, politically and culturally, the exploitation and domination of one class of human beings over another. This was the Enlightenment thinkers' explanation of why political regimes such as hereditary royalty, aristocracy, and with respect to feminism, the encapsulation of human life into gender roles, and not just different gender roles, but of course the theme of feminism is that the traditional role distinction meant subordination and exploitation of women by men. That this is part of the original immaturity of the human species. But with the progress of science, rationality, and the concept of rights, the human race is now evolving out of those original primitive structures. That concept, by the way, still essentially undergirds all modern politics and culture. And even in terms of what we call conservatives and liberals in contemporary culture, they're all children of this doctrine, so to speak. And as we'll see when we talk about different strands of feminism after we examine Betty Friedan and the growth of the modern women's movement, and examine different varieties of feminism, like difference feminism or radical feminism, the feminist thinker who takes this concept and extends it to its absolute most is, of course, Shulamite Firestone, who in the Dialectic of Sex argues that this process of progress and maturation and development of the human species can become now self-conscious with science, where science will give human beings the power to reshape our very own natural foundations and eventually eliminate gender as a natural phenomenon. More about that in this course later. So the point of departure, the thing that makes Wollstonecraft's thought unique, is she takes the general notion of enlightenment as this notion of historical progress of the human race and applies it to gender relations, to patriarchy, and that's why she. It's accurate to say in some ways she is the true originator of modern feminist thought. So a little bit about how the question of gender, and this is letter B under Roman numeral 1, a little bit of how the question of gender becomes central to modern political philosophy. For political philosophy, because there are other thinkers like Spinoza and Descartes and some of whom we examined in modern political philosophy, but the thinker who's most central to the concretization, the coagulation of modern politics and modern thought as we know them, and is Thomas Hobbes, after Machiavelli. Machiavelli wrote The Prince in 1513, and then Hobbes, as I mentioned earlier, was a contemporary of Descartes and Spinoza in Holland, Descartes in France, and Hobbes in England. But it's Hobbes who really occupies the central place in the emergence of modern liberalism. Why? Because in his great work, Leviathan, in 1651, published right in the middle of the dislocations of the English Civil War, and just a little bit of background there. Remember that in 1641, the great conflict between Parliament and Crown and between Anglican and Puritans exploded in the English Revolution, in which Charles I was first deposed and then in 1649 decapitated, and the royal aristocracy was replaced momentarily by the Puritan Republic of Oliver Cromwell, the Protector and the Protectorate. Of course, the restoration of the monarchy occurred in 1656 after Cromwell was deposed, and the English people got tired of radical Puritanism. So Hobbes wrote right in the middle of that, and in the same way that I don't want to reduce Wollstonecraft to her background, I don't want to reduce Hobbes to his background, but there's no question that as Hobbes watched the decline and destruction of his society in a terribly bloody civil war, and watched the same thing unfold in Europe to some degree as the Reformation occurred, that Hobbes' political philosophy emerges as a kind of a reaction to or cure for the distresses of society. Hobbes thought that the worst thing, as Plato thought, by the way, and as you could say that, as we observed in our own Civil War, that the worst thing that can happen to a society is civil war. Civil wars are the bloodiest and most hate-dominated forms. I guess in the same way that Cain and Abel or Jacob and Esau, the brothers turning against each other can be more destructive than enemies, or once brothers become enemies. Just to remind you that our own Civil War was the most bloody war in our history, with the highest death toll of around 750,000. That historians have kind of corrected that and upped it. So there's some notion that Hobbes' political philosophy takes its bearings for how do you state the true principles of politics and society and human nature in such a way that you prevent the descent of a political order into the fratricidal struggle of civil war. And the reason that he takes the precedence as the great promulgator of modern politics is it is he in this great work of political philosophy who formulates the concept of natural rights in chapters 13 and 14 of that great book. Now, I don't want to go fully into that. We've talked about what liberalism is and why equality and freedom and rights and power are the kind of hallmarks of modern views of human life. But Hobbes does turn then to the question of gender. And so if you're looking at the notes, this is a somewhat extensive quote from the Leviathan in chapter 20, in which Hobbes then turns to the question of the power that men have over women in society. And so if you follow along from chapter 20 of Leviathan, dominion is acquired in two ways, by generation and by conquest. The right of dominion by generation is that which the parent hath over his children, and is called paternal, and is not so derived from the generation as if, therefore, the parent had dominion over his child because he begat him, but from the child's consent. By the way, Hobbes has this very broad and diffuse notion of consent, that if I hold a gun to your head and I say, do this or I'll kill you, and you do it, it's not that I forced you to do it, but rather you consented to do it because you chose to obey me rather than to be killed. Locke, for your information, thinks that that's baloney, and in the Two Treatises of Government, second treatise, he argues that that's not consent at all. That is, in fact, terrorized tyrannization. And, by the way, it won't surprise you to hear that this concept of force versus consent becomes a dominant theme in all of modern feminist writing. That even when we come to modern feminism, post-Friedan, Friedan and post-Friedan, you'll see that even both sameness and difference feminists argue that the task of reform in human life, feminist reform, is to make sure that the true process of consent is what is the key of every human relationship and the basis of every social and political structure. It wouldn't be a trivialization of this point to say that when we even look at contemporary issues on like campus culture, like rape culture or date rape or this kind of stuff, or what both Wollstonecraft and her successors in feminist orientations will see is you'll know we'll get there to the good society when every relationship between a single man and woman and every relationship between men and women, and in fact all members of society, is based on conscious consent. So it's not an accident that for many of our contemporary social and political debates, the question is at what point consent is generated. Hence, many campuses and universities have tried to formulate extensive behavioral codes in which when especially women, but ultimately any sexual relationship or anything, even between members of the same gender, the question is how do you know when yes means yes? So all of this goes back to the foundations of these great movements of thought. So anyway, to continue with Hobbes, but from the child's consent, in other words, why does a parent have power over a child? Not because the parent begat the child. Both Hobbes and Locke, by the way, responded to certain traditional, and you could even call them conservative, versions of Christian political philosophy in which the argument was, why does the king have royal authority? It's because the king is in the place of the father in traditional patriarchal thought. Hobbes is rejecting that here, by the way. And so he's arguing that a parent doesn't have authority over a child because the parent begat the child, especially the father begotten children, but because the child has consented to be ruled by the parent. So to continue, either express or by other sufficient arguments declared. For as to generation, God hath ordained to man a helper, and there be always two that are equally parents, which is, by the way, that's a philosophic way of saying it takes two to tango. The dominion, therefore, over the child should belong equally to both, and the child should be equally subject to both, which is impossible, for no man can obey two masters. And whereas some have attributed the dominion to the man only, as being of the more excellent sex, sort of a nod to, and a rejection of this width of Aristotelian natural distinction that Saxonhouse talks about in chapter 4 of her book, and that we examined when we looked at Aristotle's political philosophy, they misreckon it. For there is not always that difference of strength or prudence between the man and the woman as that the right can be determined without war. Obviously, you should just know that Hobbes was never married. He was a bachelor until he died in his 90s. But he understood that marriage was, in fact, a kind of war. Anyway, in commonwealth, this controversy is decided by the civil law, and for the most part, but not always, the sentence is in favor of the father. Because for the most part, commonwealths have been erected by the fathers and not by the mothers of families. But the question lieth now in the state of mere nature, when there are supposed no laws of matrimony, no laws for the education of children, but the law of nature and the natural inclinations of the sexes one to another and to their children. In this condition of mere nature, prior to the emergence of civil society and politics, either the parents between themselves dispose of the dominion over the child by contract, or do not dispose thereof at all. If they dispose thereof, the right passeth according to the contract. We find in history that the Amazons, he treats the story in Herodotus of the notion of the race of women warriors, which generated, of course, our great contemporary heroine, Wonder Woman, that the Amazons contracted with the men of the neighboring countries to whom they had recourse for issue. And by the way, Herodotus treats the Amazonian nation as a historical reality, and Hobbes, in some ways, in this allusion to Herodotus, also considers that the Amazons were probably a real culture. That the Amazons contracted with the men of the neighboring countries to whom they had recourse for issue, and that the issue male should be sent back, but the female remain with themselves, so that the dominion of females with the mother. So what Hobbes argues is that by nature, patriarchy is false. There is no natural hierarchy of men over women. And that the reason that some thinkers have concluded that patriarchy is natural and that rule of male over female is natural is because most people absorb the cultural and political ideas and attitudes of their circumstances and project them onto nature. Now, but what Hobbes is saying is that that's so. Why has the belief that men should rule over women in a patriarchal reasons, because the father begets the family, and in the same way that the father is the head of the natural head of the family, the king is the head of the political order or whatever. Hobbes says that's baloney, and the only reason that people believe that is they've mistaken the nature of their contemporary surroundings for the true world of human being. So, hold on to this idea, because this becomes a central theme in Wollstonecraft and Friedan and all modern feminism, that the views of gender relations are in essence the absolutization or projection or turning into natural authority of what in fact are only contemporary local or historical social customs and views. And by the way, the thinker who in Western thought most powerfully develops this prior to Wollstonecraft is Rousseau, who argues that all prior philosophic views of human beings were nothing other than reflections of those social orders. As Rousseau says in the second discourse, other philosophers tried to see nature, but actually all they managed to do was to absorb the ideas of their surrounding societies and project them onto this blank screen of nature, turning their social and political views into authoritative statements about human nature. But that's nonsense. It's baloney. And you'll see that, like for instance, this idea specifically in the material that we're considering in this course, this is contained in Friedan's notion of the feminine mystique, that the feminine mystique, that women are in some ways different from men, and possess this mysterious concept of powerful femininity, different from masculine power. That's essentially a male invention projected onto women to subordinate women to men. We'll see that when we turn to the feminine mystique. So I'm going to wrap this up in a little bit and lay out how we're going to work through Wollstonecraft's work in class today and on Tuesday. And essentially I do this by and we'll do the same with Friedan. We resolve this into 4 primary core questions. A, and this is Roman numeral 2. What does she see? And generally you'll see when you read the book, this is in generally chapters 4, 7, and 9, and in her own introduction, and in chapter 1 to some degree. What does she see? What's the condition of women and men, but women especially, as she looks out at society? B, how did this happen? How did this, and what does she see? And if you're looking at the notes, it's like almost like a cheerleader's chant. She sees a world of inequality, dependence, domination, and deformation. And then if you look on the notes, and we'll discuss this, the way I refine this is, you should really probably reverse this order. She sees women as deformed in society, degraded really, because of the domination of men, which stems from the dependence that women have on men, and which derives from an unnatural view of human inequality. The second great question is, well, how did this happen? How did the general deformation and domination of women by men as the default setting of society come to be? And you'll see that this is why you have to go back to this concept of enlightenment that I talked about earlier. And you'll see that her explanation of how gender roles emerged and came to shape almost all human societies is a combination of force and fraud. Friedan and most feminists, de Beauvoir, Woolf, Perkins Gilman, they all essentially accept this explanation. Gender roles emerged from a primitive time in human life, and essentially this what she sees or what they see was essentially the combination of force and fraud. Frozen, my cat, who is not my cat, just came in and she said hello. I'll have to feed her. Come here, sweetheart. Yo hablo con ella en español porque ella es la gata de mis amigas y amigos down the street from me. All right, so anyway, the third great question is, what does she want? So what does she see? How did it happen? What does she want? What's the kind of reform she wants to bring to the place of women and men in the world? And you'll see, if you're looking at the notes, we'll see that and these are essentially chapters 12, 13, a couple of scattered around the book, but essentially in those two chapters, a revolution in female manners, meaning a combination of private reform, a new kind of marriage, political reform, the suffrage and political power for women, economic reform, economic independence for women, and educational reform, that men and women should have the same education. So much for Converse College. And then the last great question are, what are her standards? Where does she get this view of human life? Now, I've already suggested the answer to this by suggesting that the critical background for her is the Enlightenment. And so we'll talk about her standards for weighing human life. And then in Roman numeral E, by the way, we'll ask some subsidiary questions or subsequent questions about the nature of her thought and the criticism and affirmation that subsequent feminists and feminist authors have suggested Wollstonecraft to. So we'll see you at class today at 3 o'clock and on Tuesday at 3.